This is the DIY Audio Teenager's car, and we are going all out. New head unit, backup camera, subwoofer, new speakers in all the doors, and of course a pair of amplifiers. We're going to be cutting a little bit of cost by recycling some gear. I've had these amps for years. They used to be in my truck. They've been sitting around collecting dust on a shelf. Both of these amplifiers are long discontinued, but I'll give you some links to the updated version down in the description. As far as the amp rack itself goes, one of the big challenges is always trying to figure out where to mount the darn thing. The original plan was to put it on the left-hand side, but when I started spacing things out, I realized that the trunk wasn't exactly symmetrical and there was actually more room on the right-hand side. And when I pulled back the trunk liner and carpet, here is what I found. Right here, there is this metal panel with 4 keyhole slots. And right beside it is a threaded hole that clearly was intended to be a factory ground point. It looks almost like there was a mounting point for an amplifier or some other piece of equipment right from the factory, so there must be some option the car doesn't have. So I'm going to grab some plastic in order to build a mount. Now I could have mounted everything right to this point and hid everything behind a factory panel, but I decided that I wanted to be able to see the amplifiers and more importantly get to them if I needed to change a fuse or tune the amplifiers. So how do I know that this spot right here is actually a good solid ground point? Well, the answer to that question is I asked for some help. I have a neighbor across the street who works for a major automotive company. Anytime I tear into a car, I go knock on his door and ask for his opinion before I start taking things apart. One of the most important things you can do as a DIYer is find friends that are into this stuff that can help you out when you need a little bit of help. Last summer, he was installing some components in his truck and he needed some custom mounts made, and I just grabbed some plastic and my router table and made some nice mounts for him. Then we pulled out my oscilloscope and set his gains. Another thing that's really important when you're a DIYer is you constantly have to be improving your skills. As an independent content creator, that's especially important for me because I have all these moving parts I have to keep up with, which is why I joined Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes. They even offer classes on things like acoustics and woodworking. Now, I'm not a professional woodworker, and I upgraded my skills by watching Michael St. Amy's woodworking classes. I started off with his table saw safety video, where he provides a ton of insight into the proper and safe use of a table saw. Skillshare is ad-free and they launch new classes every single week. So if you'll check the link down in the description, the first 1,000 people to click on that link and sign up for Skillshare will get a free month of Skillshare. For the mount, I'm going to take some ABS plastic and some PVC plastic. I'm going to use some CA glue and some screws to mount the PVC to the ABS. I'm going to drill some holes in the ABS and just grab some bolts I had laying around and bolt this apparatus to those keyhole slots. On the bottom of the amp rack, I'm going to space it off the trunk a little bit by attaching some feet. These feet will also provide some extra support and some extra mounting points for the amp rack. I'm going to cut a slit into the factory carpet and that mount will stick out from the slit. Now this is actually only the second time I have attempted to do one of these clean wire style amp racks. Before I started watching 5-Star Stereo and learned how to do that, all of my installs looked like crap. Wires everywhere. It was pandemonium. But today we're shooting for neat and clean. The first challenge is figuring out the layout. I want all of the gain controls at the top so I can easily get to them when I'm setting up the amplifiers. I also want easy access to all the fuses. I probably spent an hour and a half off camera just setting the amplifiers down and spinning them in different directions, trying to figure out the best possible layout. One of the key considerations is I'm using some 6-channel RCAs. These are Stinger RCAs. I'll give you a link to them down in the description. It's my favorite kind of RCA cable because you only have to deal with one run of RCAs and there's just less clutter and wires to run. The downside is you don't have much wiggle room at the end to run your RCAs to your different amplifiers. It's important to point out as well that this Rockford Fosgate amp does not have any onboard fusing, so it's really important that you make sure you've got a fuse for this amplifier. Every time you reduce the wire size, you need a fuse, so that's one thing to always keep in mind. So now at this point, I figured out where I want the fuse blocks mounted, and I'm gonna go ahead and screw those down. Some of these screws were a little bit on the long side, so I flipped the amp rack over and filed them down. In the past, I used a Dremel to trim these down, and what I found is that the Dremel just generates too much heat and it starts to melt the plastic. fantastic. I'm gonna be running some 8-gauge wire to the 4-channel amp, and I'm gonna run 4-gauge wire to the mono amplifier. My original plan was to just use some scraps of wire that I had laying around, but I went to my wire bin and I didn't have any scraps long enough to wrap all the way around the amplifiers the way I had planned. So I had to take a little break in the project and run out to a local store and buy some more wire. Now, the amp wiring kit that I got to run the main wire from the front to the back was New Concepts that I picked off of Amazon. I'll be sure to give you a link down in the description for that. But the local shop was using JL Audio wire, and I've never used their wire before. And at first, I wasn't really happy with what I saw because they had this clear jacket silver wire for their ground wire. And of course, you look at the silver and you think, what is this wire here? That doesn't look like copper. What this is the same stuff New Concepts used. It is tinned oxygen-free copper. And that is the best wire out there. That's the kind of wire that you want. Oxygen-free copper so it carries plenty of current, and then it's tinned to give it some extra corrosion resistance. Now it's time to grab a drill and a stack of zip ties. If you're trying to do this for yourself, go get some extra zip ties. You're gonna need a huge stack of them. You'll use the zip ties here on the amp board and to secure it to the factory wiring throughout the entire car. They're not expensive and they really improve your install. And one of the reasons why my previous installs were always a complete rat's nest was simply because I didn't understand that I needed a lot of zip ties in order to pull this off. I'm going to start with the RCA cables. The idea here is to route the RCA cables so that they exit the amp rack at the back. I want to try to minimize interaction with the power cable so I can minimize noise. Next, I'm going to grab some 9 wire. There are several companies that make this product. This was from Install Bay. I just picked it up off of Amazon. What this is, it's a bundle of wire. From the outside, it looks to be about a 4-gauge power wire. But when you strip open the jacket, you find 9 wires. And these wires are color-coded. They correspond to the standard color coding for car audio speaker wire. Now, there's a blue wire in the bundle, and that is your amplifier turn-on lead. So I'm going to start with the amplifier turn-on lead. I'll be cutting all of these wires 2 different lengths, and the amp turn-on lead needs to be the longest one. I'm going to grab a ferrule, and I'm going to crimp a ferrule onto the amp turn-on lead, and while I'm at it, I'm going to crimp in another wire. So this ferrule will go into the 4-channel amp, and the other wire will wrap around in the wire bundle, and it will go turn on the subwoofer amplifier. And the rest of the wires are the speaker wires. White and gray are the front wires, green and purple are the rear wires. The front wires are the ones that are first in line on the amplifier, so those will be cut a little bit shorter so that they'll all line up perfectly. In order to make sure things look neat and clean, I'm going to be cramping some ferrules onto these as well. And to kind of clean things up a little bit, I'm going to put a little bit of shrink wrap right here where I cut back the big outer sleeve. And then out comes the drill and the zip ties. After they're all zip tied into place, I'm gonna grab some flush cutters and cut them all off. And here is where I noticed, and you will too, they're not evenly spaced. So the next time I do this, I'm gonna order one of those wire ruler things to make sure they're all evenly spaced. All right, moving on to the power and ground. The Alpine amplifier uses these old school style terminals, and I'm going to crimp on a fork terminal. Now, this hydraulic crimper makes for a really strong connection, but this particular model leaves a really ugly crimp. We'll slip on some heat shrink to cover up the ugly, and we have a nice clean connection for our power wire into our amplifier. A few years ago, I ordered a bunch of 4-gauge wire ferrules. It's always nice to put a ferrule on these when you can. I was going to use a ferrule inside of the fuse block, but the fuse block wasn't big enough to accept the wire ferrule. And I didn't have any 8-gauge wire ferrules on hand for the smaller wire. I'll have to order some of those before I do another install. Okay, so now it's time to take the amp rack into the car, and before I do that, I'm gonna go ahead and do a little more disassembly of the car. I'm gonna go ahead and pull the back seat out. I find it's just easier to find a way through the back seat with the back seat not there. This is the Kia Forte, and it's pretty easy to get the back seat out. There are 2 large bolts that hold the seat into place on the back of the seat. You just take a socket with an extension, push the foam down out of the way, and you can get access to the bolts, and you undo them. Then there is a button you push on the front that releases a front clip. It's easier to see that button outside of the car, so I'll show it to you here. I don't really have the right kind of lights for filming inside of a car, so all of the footage that I captured in the car all looks like crap. crap. One of my goals is to save up and get some better lights so that I can make better videos for all of you. And that's why I ask for your support on Patreon. I use the support I get from my patrons to upgrade all the equipment that I need in order to film my projects. And for that, I want to say thank you to all my patrons. With an additional shout out to Dylan, Bo, Baba, Speaker Labs, LLC, and Doug, aka Bam Bam. Thank you so much for your support, everybody. I really appreciate it. All right, so since I couldn't film in the car anyways, I put the camera away and I got some work done. Here is a shot of the power wire running down the driver's side. I still need to grab my zip ties and zip tie that sucker into place. Down the other side, here's the Speedwire and the RCAs. I'm going to be using the Speedwire to tap back into the factory wiring. And of course, more on that later as well. Now we need to get the power wire through the firewall and to the battery. And this is, in my opinion, the single most important part of the install, because this is the one part that if you mess it up, you will cause a large amount of damage. Do not take a shortcut here. Before you start this part, scour the internet. Find someone else who's done the exact same thing with your car and figured out a safe way through the firewall. Pick up the phone and call a friend. I, of course, called my buddy across the street who knows how cars are put together, and I got his opinion on where to go through. Now, this is a 2013 Kia Forte, and the 2010 to 2013 model were all the same. And so in my search for a great place to run the power wire, I landed on the Forte forums. And there is a great post on those forums talking about a good way to get the power wire through the firewall. What they recommended that you do was to run the power wire into the fender and then jack the car up, pull the front tire off, and remove this inner plastic cover between the tire and the inner fender. And then from there, you can find a grommet and just run the power wire through that grommet. One person chimed in and commented and said, hey, there is a spot to drill through the firewall. Here's how you get through the firewall. All right, get down under the dash and find the brake pedal. Look up to where all the brake pedal mechanism attaches to the firewall. On the other side of that, in the engine bay, that's where your brake booster is gonna be. And just to the left of that is this little spot where you can pop the carpet off. There's this kind of rectangle shape there, and there's these two bolts that stick out of it. Right here is where you wanna drill through. And if you look under the hood down at the firewall, you can see that spot. There's a little bit of bare metal right on that spot. What you're gonna wanna do is get a piece of scrap material. Maybe it's just an old rag, maybe it's a piece of wood or a piece of plastic, and put down in there between the factory wiring and that panel so that you don't accidentally hit some factory wires if you go full Leroy Jenkins through that firewall. Then from the inside of the car, grab a drill and go full Leroy Jenkins through that firewall. I couldn't film the drilling because I couldn't hold the flashlight and the drill and the camera at the same time. But right here is where I went through. And when I turned the flashlight off, you can see a little bit of daylight peeking through from the engine bay. And here's what it looks like after drilling the pilot hole out with a step bit. Now you pop a plastic grommet into that hole to protect the wire. That's important. You want to protect the wire. If that wire gets cut, it's going to cause a short. And if the fuse doesn't blow, you've just lost the car. And if this process of trying to get through the firewall scares you or intimidates you or worries you at all, or if the car is a really nice new car instead of an old Kia, pay a shop. You're gonna want to run the power wire from the inside. It is really hard to reach that metal panel. There's a ton of stuff in the way, but if you'll just run the wire through, it'll be pretty easy to grab and pull up next to the battery. All right, it's the next day and I was able to get the fuse holder figured out. I probably spent an hour and a half just trying to figure out where I wanted to put the fuse. I didn't get everything I wanted on camera because I'm out here hustling trying to get this car back together. All right, you can see the red wire right here. We're coming up from the firewall, running right beside the ECU right here to our fuse holder. We have an L-shaped fuse holder. Got some shrink wrap on it, looking good. Gonna put some split loom on it later. This is gonna go right in here like this, roughly. And here is the air cleaner box. And right down here is a bolt that bolts the battery tray to the air cleaner. And then the power wire is gonna come straight up through here and hook onto our positive terminal. I'm going to be putting a ferrule on the wire and holding the ferrule on with some shrink wrap. I always try to use ferrules whenever I can. I'm going to clip on a ring terminal and add some heat shrink. I will be putting some loom around everything so it's nice and tidy and clean. I'm going to reconnect the positive and negative battery terminal, make sure everything checks out just fine, and then I'm going to move on to the radio and the backup camera. And when those two things are done, I'm going to put them right here. In the meantime, hit that subscribe button right there so you don't miss it. I'm Justin, aka the DIY Audio Guy, and I will see you on the next adventure.